Rosenthal, editor of the National Interest. We're here today with Richard Perle, who probably needs no introduction, has a cover story for us in the January-February issue on the neoconservative agenda and perhaps the neoconservative non-conspiracy. And we're going to hopefully talk with you today about why you think there is not going to be much change in foreign policy between the Bush administration and now the Obama administration. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Well, the simple answer to that question is that for at least the last 4 years of the Bush administration, the second term, and actually well into the first term, foreign policy was largely made not in the White House but in the State Department. The State Department's still there. A few positions have changed at the top. It's Hillary and not Condi. But Condi sounded a lot like Hillary toward the end. So I don't expect much of a change in substance. I think there will be a change, has already been a change in tone. And in this, with respect to tone, how things are put, how policies are explained, the Bush administration may have been the most incompetent in living memory. They couldn't explain themselves. And the Obama administration will do better at that, as the Clinton administration did before. So you have two reasonably articulate administrations, and in the middle, an administration that largely followed the default policies but couldn't explain them.
Why do you think they were not able to articulate their policies well?
Bush himself was not terribly articulate, although toward the end he was certainly able to read a speech a lot better than in the beginning. He wasn't a conversationalist. He had good speechwriters, but when he was on his own, he was not compelling as a presenter of views. He was not a great communicator. But having said that, the way that communications were run in the White House was unbelievably narrow and restrained. A handful of people were authorized to speak for the administration. There were many people who had things to say, who simply were not given an opportunity to say them. So you had the Scott McClellans of the world, not very deep, not profound, not able much better to explain things than Bush himself. And that was the interface with the world.
What does this mean for you concretely in terms of policy not changing on North Korea, on Iran, even on Iraq? What do you expect to see then?
Well, I certainly hope that President Obama will be persuaded not to put at risk the very considerable success that has been achieved in Iraq and the promising future of that country. It's fragile, it's delicate, it could be throttled in its cradle, and I hope we don't get a premature withdrawal of American forces that has that effect. I don't think we will. I think he will be more careful and more attentive than that. With respect to Iran and North Korea, he's put a great emphasis on the manner in which we conduct a dialogue. This is a typical mistake. It's failing to distinguish between form and substance. The North Koreans, the Iranians know very well what U.S. thinking and U.S. policy is. They could at any time enter into an agreement with us if they chose to do so, but they're not ready to agree, in the case of Iran, to abandon nuclear weapons, in the case of North Korea, to transform itself from a criminal pariah regime into something better. And so Obama's overtures, his reordering of the modalities of the conversation, will have no significant effect, in my view. And then he'll have to come up with a plan B. And plan B is going to look an awful lot like the Bush policy.
And what would you recommend if you were making policy for dealing with Iran and North Korea, since they seem to be entrenching themselves? You're almost hearing talk now that people are accepting North Korea in some ways as a nuclear state.
Well, North Korea depends on help from the outside. And if it were up to me, I would be designing a strategy for cutting off that outside support. I don't think they could last very long without it. A lot of it comes from China, and the question is, how do you get the Chinese to cooperate? And one way is to persuade the Chinese that if we can't deal with the North Koreans effectively through diplomatic pressure, we're going to have to look at other options. Wouldn't get into detail about what those options are. In the case of Iran, we've wasted a great deal of time during which we could have been working with the internal opponents of the regime. I think we can still do that, although it's late and much less promising than it would have been several years ago. But we've been talking to the Iranians in various ways since Khomeini came to power, and anyone who thinks that talking to them in a different place or bilaterally rather than through the Europeans is going to make a difference is, I think, really quite mistaken. They are determined to develop nuclear weapons. People of Iran don't understand the implications of that. They don't understand how they're suffering partly because of that, and they have no concept of the cost of that program. We could do a great deal more to help an already discontented Iranian public understand its situation. And that's what I would do.
Now, if we could close with what you think will be the neocon agenda now. There has been some talk from columnists that there isn't a need to change the philosophies, others that the Republican Party at the very least needs to rethink how they are positioning themselves, how they speak to the American public, as in many ways sort of the epitome of neocon thinking. How are you approaching this now?
I don't believe there is such a thing as a neocon attitude on questions of foreign and defense policy. I think neoconservatism arose in the context, largely in the context of domestic policies. It was a reaction against the belief in the effectiveness of large government, which people like Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz and others began to doubt seriously. I can't identify a distinctively neoconservative foreign policy. Most of the people I know who have worked in the foreign policy or defense policy arena in government would describe themselves as pragmatists. Now, ironically, the charge that people like Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith, me for that matter, are ideologues, comes from people who often are ideologues themselves, who have a blind faith in multilateral institutions, who believe in the efficacy of international law and international institutions like the United Nations, which has proven itself to be incapable of serious action when required, rare exception. So I simply don't accept the concept of a neoconservative foreign policy. I do understand the concept of a sort of false realist critique of what is said to be neoconservative thinking, and that critique seems to me to be riddled with ideological positions.
Well, thank you. I think it's a perfect note to end on. Hopefully we can continue this conversation again.
We will.